In 2022, Texas couple LILIANA Cervantes and Nathan Freeman moved from Lubbock to Houston with the former's young son and their new baby daughter. By the following spring, they'd reportedly begun making plans to get married, with Cervantes having already purchased a wedding dress. The burgeoning family was left devastated, however, following a booze-fueled argument between Cervantes and Freeman on March the 20th of 2023. According to the 25-year-old woman's testimony to the police, she and Freeman had been drinking heavily that night and eventually started arguing. Cervantes ultimately blacked out with their infant daughter next to her. When she regained consciousness, she found Freeman standing by the front door covered in blood. He collapsed to the floor, at which point Cervantes allegedly tried to clean up the blood with bath towels so her son wouldn't see it. She then attempted to stitch her boyfriend's wounds herself with a needle and thread, but came to realize that there was far too much blood. Having wasted crucial time trying to patch the man up herself, Cervantes finally dialed 911, and emergency crews were dispatched to the scene at around 8:45 p.m. 32-year-old Freeman was pronounced dead, with his cause of death later being attributed to 3 stab wounds he'd sustained, including one to the chest. Houston homicide detectives seized a butcher knife and another unspecified sharp object from the couple's blood-soaked residence. They determined that in her blacked-out state, Cervantes had used the knives to fatally stab her boyfriend. On April the 3rd, they issued a warrant for her arrest in connection with the murder. Number 6. Mark Smich and Dellen Millard. Toronto residents Mark Smich and Dellen Millard were first introduced to one another in 2006. Although Millard was said to have initially despised Smich, they eventually developed a strong bond, which led to the latter and his girlfriend moving into the basement of the Millard household in 2012. It was around that time that the pair began going out on so-called missions, in which they'd commit thefts, strictly for the thrill of it. On the night of May the 6th of 2013, the pair's criminal activity escalated. They got in contact with a man named Tim Bosma, who was selling a pickup truck online. Smich and Millard arranged a test drive and went to Bosma's residence in Ancaster, a small community within the city of Hamilton, Ontario. Upon the two men's arrival, Bosma told his wife they'd be right back, but she ended up calling the police to report her husband missing after not hearing from him for several hours. The Hamilton Police Service ultimately determined that Bosma had been gunned down during the test drive. His body was then cremated using an animal incinerator at Millard's hangar at the region of Waterloo International Airport. In court, Smith tried to pin responsibility for the murder entirely on Millard, claiming the latter had been the one to fire the fatal round. Smith also said he couldn't remember key details about the killing and subsequent cover-up. When pressed about his purported amnesia, the man indicated that he'd been smoking marijuana and drinking copious amounts of alcohol earlier on the day of the murder, which allegedly clouded his memory and caused him to partially black out. Millard likewise tried to blame his friend for the crime, but in the end, both were convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. A year later, the pair were found guilty of a second murder, that of Laura Babcock, who'd last been seen alive in July of 2012. Smith and Millard consequently received additional life sentences and won't be eligible for parole until 2063. Number 5. Connor Shyman. Washington man Connor Shyman awoke face down in a stranger's blood-stained bed on July the 17th of 2006. Disoriented and unsure of how he ended up there, the Kirkland resident got up and walked down the hallway, whereupon he came across a pair of dead bodies. He proceeded through the rest of the house, encountering 2 additional bodies in the process, one in a bedroom and another at the bottom of the stairs. Shyman subsequently took a shower, then purchased 2 containers of gasoline at a nearby convenience store, which he used to set fire to the house. The victims' burned bodies were found later that day. They were identified as 28-year-old Olga Milkin, her sister, and her 2 sons. Milkin reportedly lived across the street from Shyman, who was arrested shortly after the crime scene was discovered. At the time of the murders, Milkin's husband, Leonard, was reportedly serving in Iraq with the National Guard. According to psychiatrist Dr. Andrew Saxon, who ultimately testified in court for the defense, the suspect had no recollection of the events that led to the 4 violent deaths. Shyman was believed to have consumed 3 bottles of Ketel One vodka prior to the killings, which triggered an alcohol-induced blackout. During the resulting trial, which took place in early 2010, the court heard testimony from police, firefighters, Shyman's roommates, DNA experts and members of the victim's family, culminated in the defendant receiving a guilty verdict for 4 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of arson. He was consequently sentenced to death and, following an appeal, had his conviction upheld in 2018. Number 4. Kimberly Gable. Shortly after 1 p.m. on November the 10th of 2018, the police in St. Petersburg, Florida, were called to the Red Lobster located at 6151 34th Street North. The manager of the restaurant had contacted law enforcement after an intoxicated woman, later identified as 42-year-old Kimberly Gable, started making a scene. She was asked to leave for disturbing other customers, but in a brazen act of defiance, reached her hand into a tank containing a live lobster. She pulled the crustacean out of the water and fled from the restaurant, but she was located by a responding sheriff's deputy sometime later. The lobster was nowhere to be found. According to an arrest affidavit, Gable was adamant that she'd done nothing wrong, but couldn't recall what she'd done with the lobster because she was blackout drunk. She was booked at the county jail on a misdemeanor count of disorderly intoxication before being bonded out. The woman's lengthy criminal record included past arrests for theft, drug possession, carrying an open container of alcohol, domestic battery, drunk driving, and resisting an officer. Number 3. Derek Barrett. In April of 2016, the bound and mutilated body of 26-year-old Meng Mai Leng was found floating face down in the blowhole at Snapper Point, on the central coast of New South Wales, Australia. 5 years earlier, Leng had moved to the country from China to attend university. She'd reportedly been living with her uncle, aunt, and cousin in the southwest Sydney suburb of Campsie. The uncle, Derek Barrett, was ultimately identified as a suspect during the ensuing investigation. 29-year-old Barrett was accused of bounding and gagging his niece before subjecting her to 2 days of abuse, some of which he documented in graphic photos and videos. Leng's agonizing ordeal came to an end when Barrett fatally stabbed her upwards of 40 times while blacked out from excessive use of the drug ice. He then dumped her body at Snapper Point, but a tourist noticed it 3 days later and brought it to the attention of local authorities. Barrett's wife had reportedly been out of town when he committed the murder. When the case was initially brought to trial in 2017, the full extent of the torture Leng endured before she died hadn't yet come to light. After he was convicted of the crime, Barrett was sentenced to a minimum of 34.5 years behind bars, which many viewed as a disproportionately lenient punishment. 4 years later, the discovery of a USB stick enabled authorities to gain a clearer picture of the relentless abuse that transpired before Leng was finally killed. The horrific images found on the drive, which Barrett had captured during the commission of the crime, led Supreme Court Justice Helen Wilson to state that had she known the full extent of Barrett's actions during the original trial, she would have given him a life sentence. Although that sentence couldn't be retroactively imposed, Wilson added at least 12 more years to the man's prison term following the USB's emergence. Today's topic was requested by Instagram follower Kai Oliver. If you have any other topics you'd like to learn about, subscribe and let us know in the comments section below, or follow us on Instagram and reach out to us there. Number 2. Troy WHYE. In March of 2008, a Rutgers University student by the name of Crystal Skinner was found dead at her apartment in Lindenwold, New Jersey. According to court records, police found the 23-year-old's young son near her lifeless body at the scene of the crime. The toddler allegedly made stabbing motions while repeatedly saying, "Troy, Troy, Troy," when interviewed by detectives. The focus of the investigation subsequently fell upon Skinner's on-again, off-again partner and the father of the child, Troy WHYE. The latter had been intermittently involved with the victim for about 5 years prior to her death. Although WHYE claimed he'd never put his hands on her, it was revealed in court that the young woman had previously taken out a restraining order against him. It was further detailed how the man had once dragged Skinner out of a vehicle by the legs in the midst of a contentious argument. In their attempts to pin the murder on WHYE, authorities relied on the testimony of the man's friends, namely Ted Robertson and Michael Thompson. The former told investigators that WHYE had recalled stabbing Skinner but then claimed to have blacked out before kissing her forehead and fleeing the scene. When Thompson reached out to find out what had happened to Skinner, WHYE allegedly told him he just snapped. The man's niece also testified that prior to the stabbing, he said, "If she keeps acting like that, I'm going to have to kill her. She's getting on my nerves." in reference to Skinner. WHYE was found guilty of murder, weapons offenses, and endangering the welfare of a child in January of 2011. However, following a review of the case by an appellate panel, the conviction was reversed because the jury had been improperly instructed on a lesser charge of passion provocation manslaughter. The man was retried in 2014, leading to a second conviction and life sentence. 2 years later, the verdict was overturned again after it was determined that the prosecution had wrongly admitted evidence centered around the couple's history of domestic violence. The matter was thus sent back to trial. If you'd like to watch some more They Will Kill You today, then we have our previous release on When Overacting Goes Wrong lined up for you right after number 1. Number 1. Jerry Mitchell. A passerby noticed an unattended toddler crying in the front seat of a vehicle parked outside a sports bar in Winter Park, Florida, on the night of July the 9th of 2019. The witness went into the bar to find the child's parents, but when no one claimed her, employees called 911. Patrons who'd been in the bar's outside seating area revealed that the vehicle's hazard lights had been on for about 10 minutes before the child was discovered. Witnesses were able to get the car door open and retrieve the abandoned girl before first responders arrived at the scene. She was fortunately unharmed. One of the child's parents subsequently arrived and said that 31-year-old Jerry Mitchell was supposed to be watching the young girl. According to a bartender, Mitchell had entered friendly confines located on Aloma Avenue at around 4:45 p.m. and appeared to be intoxicated. When he closed his tab out a couple of hours later, Mitchell then returned to the bar about 15 minutes later and continued drinking for another hour, then left and came back a third time at about 9 p.m. He drank for about 2 hours, then paid and left the bar with an older woman. When he returned to the bar during the early hours of the next morning, Mitchell told law enforcement that he'd blacked out and couldn't remember picking up the child or leaving her in the car. In the incident's wake, he faced charges of child neglect and leaving a child unattended in a motor vehicle. Number 8. Shelley Vaughan. In 2022, Florida man Eric Addison got into an argument with his ex-girlfriend Shelley Vaughan at his apartment in Clearwater Beach. As the man would later report, 46-year-old Vaughan had been drinking and consuming illicit substances leading up to their row. The heated interaction escalated after, in a fit of rage, the woman had launched Addison's keys and cell phone over the railing of his balcony. Vaughan then grabbed the man's pug, Bucky, and threw him from the balcony as well. The incident was witnessed by several residents and the pet dropped 7 stories to the parking lot below, sustaining fatal injuries. The police were called and Addison subsequently told officers that he was devastated and that the entire incident was like a blur in his mind. He claimed that Vaughan had been violent in the past but noted that he'd never imagined she'd go so far. The woman was jailed on charges of aggravated animal cruelty, criminal mischief, and domestic battery. Addison also filed a civil lawsuit against his ex, and because she lived 2 floors below him, obtained a restraining order that prevented Vaughan from making contact with him. Number 7. Benno Nume. 30-year-old Italian bodybuilder Benno Nume was arrested by local authorities in the province of South Tyrol in late January of 2021 in connection to the murder of his parents. Teacher Peter Nume and his wife Laura had been reported missing, and the ensuing investigation led the authorities to their son. He confessed to the double homicide after his arrest and revealed that his murderous rage had been triggered by an argument with his father. While at their home in Bolzano, the latter had asked that Benno get out of bed and take the family dog out for a walk. When he refused, Peter began scolding him and complaining that he wasn't doing his share of household chores, reportedly calling him a failure. The bodybuilder subsequently reported, "I just wanted silence, so I shut him up." He attacked Peter in the hallway and strangled him to death with a climbing rope. When his mother returned home a short while later, Benno killed her in the same manner. The man confessed to have ended her life without even saying goodbye, before throwing her and Paul's body from a bridge into the Adige River. Laura's remains were discovered in the water and exhibited signs of strangulation, but Peter's body never surfaced, with only traces of his blood being found on the bridge. Number 6. Brittany Griffith. On May the 1st of 2022, Georgia woman Brittany Griffith surrendered to Douglasville police in the aftermath of a shooting on the I-20. At around 4:40 p.m., an unspecified road rage incident had occurred between the 30-year-old and the driver of another vehicle. Even though Griffith had her 3 children in the car at the time, she started following the second vehicle, seeking retaliation for the previous confrontation. She pulled up alongside it near the Chapel Hill Road exit and opened fire with a handgun, striking a teenager who'd been sat in the passenger seat in the face. The victim was subsequently rushed to a local hospital and was later reported as being in a stable condition. One of the other passengers in the targeted car had managed to capture a photo of Griffith before she fled the scene. The police used it to ask for the public's help in identifying the woman and later arrested her. She was denied bond after being charged with 4 counts of aggravated assault, 3 counts of cruelty to children, and 1 count of possession of a firearm during commission of a felony. Number 5. Nicolette Mazziotti and James McKnight. 2 people were arrested in early August of 2019 following a road rage altercation in Greece, New York. 28-year-old Nicolette Mazziotti had been involved in a dispute with another motorist in the area of Denise Road and Hampton Boulevard. As their interaction became more heated, the woman returned to her car, retrieved a knife, and stabbed the other driver's car in the front tire before fleeing the scene. The police were called to the scene, and the unnamed victim initially declined to press charges. Officers returned to the site of the altercation within 10 minutes, responding to reports of a second and more serious attack. 33-year-old James McKnight, whose relationship with Mazziotti wasn't made immediately clear, struck the victim with an aluminium bat, inflicting injuries to the back, arm, and torso. McKnight, too, fled, but was ultimately arrested alongside Mazziotti. The former was charged with assault, second-degree petite larceny, as he'd stolen the bat used in the attack, and was denied bail due to a pre-existing felony conviction. Mazziotti was charged with second-degree harassment for the physical contact she'd had with the victim, as well as with criminal mischief for stabbing the tire. Number 4. Daria Brown. On June the 3rd of 2022, Iowa City police officers were called to a downtown bar following reports that a woman was causing damage to the establishment. 22-year-old Daria Brown had begun hitting the windows after she'd been denied entry due to her elevated level of intoxication. Law enforcement learned that Brown had also assaulted a bar employee, but no charges were pursued in that direction. Nevertheless, officers decided to take her into custody because she was intoxicated and exhibited assaultive behavior. She had a history of being combative towards the police, and efforts to verbally pacify her proved unsuccessful. Brown resisted arrest, assaulting 3 officers in the process. One of them attempted to use chemical spray on her, but the device failed to deploy, as shown by subsequently released body cam footage. Brown then tried to disarm an officer of his taser while she was being placed in the back of a patrol car. She was hit multiple times in the back until she let go of the weapon, but reportedly didn't require treatment at the time of her booking. Brown's charges included public intoxication, disarming a peace officer, and interference with official acts causing bodily injury. Number 3. Killy Nicole Cunningham. A young woman from Monroe County, Pennsylvania, became overwhelmed with rage in February of 2019 after she'd reportedly lost money to a pinball machine at the Blue Valley Lanes bowling alley. 26-year-old Killy Nicole Cunningham punched the machine's glass panel, and in an effort to calm her down, employees reimbursed her money. They then asked Cunningham to leave, but she refused, instead demanding more alcohol. When her order was denied, she threw a cup of water in a worker's face and stormed out of the establishment. Officers from the Slate Belt Regional Police Department were called to the scene and caught up to Cunningham while she was walking with a friend. They asked the woman to identify herself, but she became belligerent and started yelling profanities at them. Officers decided to take her into custody after determining that she was inebriated to the extent that she presented a danger to herself and others. As they were struggling to get her into the patrol car, Cunningham repeatedly unbuckled her seatbelt and attempted to flee, while also persisting in her aggressive behavior. She cursed and spat at officers, kicking one of them in the chest before headbutting him. Cunningham kicked a second officer as they were escorting her into the police station. Law enforcement then determined that she needed medical attention due to her high level of inebriation. The woman kept on spitting on responding EMTs and a spit hood was put on her as she was being transferred to the ambulance. Once inside, however, she forcefully bit into a paramedic's forearm, leaving a mark. Cunningham kept brawling with officers and medical staff before she was ultimately chemically sedated. In the aftermath of her violent outburst, she was charged with 3 counts of aggravated assault, 3 counts of simple assault, 1 count of resisting arrest, and 3 related offenses. Number 2. Amanda Stanton. In September of 2018, reality star Amanda Stanton was at a co-ed bachelorette party at the Wynn Encore in Las Vegas alongside her boyfriend Bobby Jacobs. At around 3 a.m., security guards were sent to the room following a noise complaint, and Jacobs began talking to them. 26-year-old Stanton, known for her appearances on The Bachelor and Bachelor in Paradise, aggressively intervened. In what was deemed a dramatic overreaction, she forcefully pushed her boyfriend. Even though Jacobs was taller than her by 1 foot and 3 inches, the shove, coupled with Stanton's drunken demeanor, was considered serious enough for the guards to call the police. The mother of 2 was arrested for misdemeanor domestic battery and later released. As reported by TMZ, the California native and Jacobs were still together in the incident's aftermath and suspected that the former's behavior had been influenced by someone spiking her drink during the party. Number 1. Michael Close. Close to noon on June the 10th of 2020, a man opened fire on a couple with an AK-47 rifle, following a dispute over dog drop-ins on the 3000 block of Fox Street in Denver, Colorado. The shooting occurred in a rock garden outside Michael Close's apartment complex, where he was reported to have confronted Isabella Thallas and Darian Simon, both in their 20s, as they were walking their dog. He'd become enraged that the pet had defecated close to his window and asked Simon if he was going to train the dog or just yell at it. Surveillance camera footage later presented by prosecutors showed Close then opening his blinds, pointing the rifle at the couple, and releasing at least 24 rounds. Thallas, who turned 21 2 days earlier, was killed instantly, while Simon survived after being shot twice in the legs. The police were alerted by Close's girlfriend, whom he'd called crying, to confess the shooting before driving towards the mountains in his black Mercedes SUV. Close was arrested without incident by Jefferson County Sheriff deputies after the police had tracked his cell phone. An investigation revealed that the rifle he'd used had been taken from the personal collection of his lifelong friend, Sergeant Dan Politica of the Denver Police, reportedly without his knowledge or permission. Close had called him minutes after the shooting to say he'd done something really bad and there's no going back from this now. Politica resigned in the shooting's aftermath, even though he wasn't being actively investigated for misconduct. Close faced 22 separate criminal counts stemming from the shooting, including first-degree murder, to which, according to the latest updates, he'd pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Thanks for watching. Would you rather find out that you tried hitting on your significant other's best friend while blackout drunk, or have an embarrassing picture of you projected on a billboard in Times Square? Let us know in the comments section below.